So to take some stock in where we are we're essentially after, the first 6 months of the off year, the midterm campaigns are starting to come together. Money reports have come in. So it's always a good time, I think, to check in with my friend Nathan Gonzalez at Inside Elections. Mr. Gonzalez, good to see you.
Great to see you. Yeah, there's no off year, Chuck. I am gonna start to ban the
Yes.
term off year. There is no off year.
Well, it's funny you
Things
say
are
that.
things are
One of my guilty pleasure podcasts is a sports card podcast called "There Is No Off Season." It's the same mindset, and I think you're right with politics. There is no off year
yeah,
anymore. And that's
arguably some of the most important developments of a race happen in these years before the actual election because members are retiring and people are
right.
positioning themselves and raising money. And some of these races are going to be effectively over by the time we get to next year, particularly ones that are decided in the primary, because all the jockeying and positioning has already taken place.
Well, why don't we start there? Because look, I want to get into what kind of disruptive third party politics is real and not real, and a little bit of that stuff. But look, we got a whole bunch of fundraising reports, retirement season. There's always sort of three chunks of retirement season when it comes to incumbent officials. There's the immediate at the new year, right? We went through that. We kind of know those. Then there's always the summer, right? We're going to get some retirements beginning about now through Labor Day, right?
Right.
Oh boy, this last session really burned me out, or whatever it is. Maybe there's a family situation. So we're likely going to get one more round. And then there's the end of the holiday retirements, right? After spending time with the family, Thanksgiving, Christmas. So we're the beginning of what could be a second sort of chunk of retirement. I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think there's any new statewide sort of scrambles left, right? Do you think most of the Senate map? I can't think of a senator, maybe there's one more retirement there in Susan Collins, right? She's one I'm still not 100% convinced. But do you feel like the state map is pretty settled on the Senate level?
I think Susan Collins is still she has said things like, I intend to or I plan
Mm-hmm.
to. I went back at the last cycle, the last time she was up, and she
Mm-hmm.
didn't make an official decision until December of the so we're 6 months away from where she made her official decision last time she was up. Wall Street Journal reported that Joni Ernst may be
Mm-hmm.
reconsidering after her comments to the town hall about,
Right.
we're all going to die. Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon has not made an official
Mm.
decision. Those rumors about him not running were a little hotter a few weeks ago than they are now,
Mm-hmm.
but he's still out there. That would be a Democratic primary. That would set off a kind of a cascade of events because you'd probably have
Two or
one,
three
two,
House
or
members.
three of the
Yeah.
Democratic women
Yeah.
in the delegation. So there's still some uncertainty, and right now we are at 7 Senate retirements. The average going back 90 years is
Mm-hmm.
5, so we're above
Mm.
average for Senate retirements. We could have another one or two.
And that doesn't count Marsha Blackburn running for governor or Michael Bennett running for governor because those only,
Correct.
but it does count Tommy Tuberville because his seat was open, right?
Correct. Yeah, with
Yeah.
Blackburn and Michael Bennett, they're not up this cycle, but if they win, then they would get to pick their own
Okay.
successor, at least for the short term.
For a year or two. It's interesting on Joni Ernst. I think it actually coincides with something I have at the beginning of this podcast, which is sort of I think methinks there's going to be an open cabinet slot in the next 6 to 8 weeks, right? It just feels that's just what Trump does. B, between Pete Hegseth, Pam Bondi, maybe even a promotion for Scott Bessent, but like you can feel there's going to be some turnover. I bring up Pete Hegseth because I do think if Hegseth goes, it's Joni Ernst. That she's, that is that's a job she wanted the first time. She was as angling for it as the best she can. I know there's a lot of people in the Trump orbit that are pretty anti those Iowa Republicans, still mad at Kim Reynolds for helping DeSantis. So and Joni Ernst and Kim Reynolds are close. So yeah, I don't know if that would be a problem for Joni Ernst on that front, but that's let's just say it's a well reported guess as to what Joni Ernst is waiting for. How's that?
And it could with Hegseth, we just had the president just had that cabinet meeting that was open
Hmm.
to the press, and the president was asked that question, and he turned to his side and asked Hegseth, and Hegseth didn't know. He's like, well, what about John? Talk about John Ratcliffe. And so I don't know, if Trump thinks that that made him look bad, then
Right.
Trump does not want to be made look foolish or bad in any light. So if he thinks
Right.
Hegseth contributed to that, then he would
Mm.
be in trouble.
No, and it does feel as if right now, I mean, if you're the White House, what cabinet agent there? I would argue there's two cabinet secretaries that give the White House the most headaches. One has been Hegseth with decisions getting made without White House finding out. That's a big headache, right? That upset your Rubios and all this stuff with the Ukraine decision. And then the other one is Kennedy, right? I mean, in this measles outbreak, that arguably the variant ought to be named for Kennedy at this point, because it feels as if he has been the leader of this movement that suddenly, I mean, yeah, I feel like every month now we've just broken a record for the largest measles outbreak we've had since, we had eradicated it. So
And
those
I
would
think
be,
we have
but I don't think Kennedy's in trouble yet, in as
And I
far as
think we
Trump's
have to
concerned.
remember why Kennedy got to this point. I don't think it was
Hmm.
because Trump was in love with his policies or his views on
Hmm.
vaccines. It was because Kennedy was a potential threat as a third party candidate to Trump. Trump, made a deal, said, "Hey, what can we do to
Hmm.
not have you run to divide my vote?" And so, hey, how about a cabinet? All right, let's go for it.
I will say this, Trump's not known for living up to his deals. He's lived up to that one, at what I think, to potential huge political danger. And I'm curious. I think this is the one of the hidden midterm issues is the management of health, not the Medicaid cuts that we know, but what Kennedy is doing over there. Um, it is putting parents in uncomfortable situations and schools. That that's one of those that you, particularly in swing suburban districts, if you're looking for an issue that could sort of, I think, be surprisingly effective, it's that one.
And it's immediate. It's so the health of your family and your kids
Hmm.
is so ever present. And if you go into a voting booth or you're at your table with your ballot,
Hmm.
and you're have this anxiety over the direction of your family
Yeah.
or the direction of the country,
Right.
then you are going to be inclined to not vote for the party that's in power that is contributing to that anxiety.
All right, let's talk about big picture. The conventional wisdom has already, I feel like, been set, which is, and in some ways, the Republicans have embraced the idea they're the underdog already to try to hold the House, and that it almost seems like it's an automatic that Democrats are going to pick up the House. And there's certainly a lot of tea leaves to read right now that look very similar to 2017 and 2018 in these special elections, and 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 yet there are some things that aren't the same. So, let's tackle it this way. If Democrats don't pick up the House, what are you seeing right now that would start to help explain how that happened?
For that scenario, well, first, history is working against Republicans and for
Right.
Democrats. So, what is the scenario where Republicans hold? It is if things are going well, right?
Hmm.
If the bill that Republicans just finally passed and got done, if that leads to this economic boost that Republicans are saying it's
Hmm.
going to, if people feel satisfied with if they're making more money and they're spending less money on their daily
Right.
lives, I think that leads to a satisfaction that would be difficult then to defeat enough or win enough House seats for Democrats to win. So it's possible. Um, it's just there's such a small margin for error. Democrats only need a net gain of three
Right.
seats, to get to that majority.
So I look at two other things. Obviously, that's the obvious. Like if that goes well, I I don't think that's going to go great, right? But in our short attention span society, that's something that could burn itself out for all we know, or the impact isn't there yet, right? Like I know the tariff bomb is going to hit hard. It just hasn't hit yet, right? And by the way, it's only now that I think even some tariffs from April are going to start, those smaller shipments from China. It's only in the next We're only going to start feeling the effects of it beginning in the next couple of weeks, so a couple of months. So it's possible that that continues to grow. But I want to throw up too, this is a more divided Democratic Party than it was in 2017 and 2018. What does that mean for this cycle in your mind?
In the end, I believe that having a common enemy is a powerful is a powerful thing, and that Democrats will unite to vote against Republicans. Now, does it affect turnout? Do fewer Democrats turn out because they are disaffected with Democratic leadership, direction of the party, lack of a leader, lack of a message, whatever? Yeah, that would contribute to Republicans
Mhm.
doing better than expected in the midterms. I think that there can be two things. I think two things can happen at the same time. That Democrats
Mhm.
are divided and searching for a new leader, searching for a
Right,
message, and also turn out to vote against Republicans. I don't think that
right.
those are two mutually exclusive situations.
It's interesting, then of course you could have the situation where their success in 26 makes them think 28's automatic, and it's not, right? Just like what happened a
Oh
little
yeah.
bit in 22.
Right. Yeah. The parties and politicians are terrible at learning lessons from from election results. They think that it's
Hmm.
because voters are in love with them when really it's just usually because they're tired of the other party, they're tired of who's in power, they want to change, they want security economically, physically, all
Hmm.
of those things. And so yeah, Democrats learning the wrong lesson from the 2022 election was one of the biggest probably mistakes in at least recent political history.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about that, and whether it's how the Biden White House interpreted it or how everybody else did,
Yeah.
there's no
Yeah,
doubt
Democrats did
that.
well in 2022 in spite of Biden, not because of
Right,
him, but that
right.
was not taken that way by important Democrats.
And I think we have multiple books that have proven this to be the case now.
Probably more. Are you right? Are you having a book too, Chuck? Who
Yeah,
who doesn't have a
you
book
know,
at this point?
and you put them all together, and it's like, I always say, the Biden books are now turning into what I used to say about the Trump books. The details are different, but the story's the same. You know what I mean? Like it'll be a new anecdote, a new version of a Hunter Biden story, but it's really the same story. It's really a form of the same story that, oh, look at how they tried to keep Biden from being in public, or look at how they did it this way, right? And you start to put together these stories, and it continues to shock.
And
Um,
yet they thought he was in a good enough position to debate, to go on a public debate.
well, I will
Right?
not.
I mean,
Well,
that's
this is why the
why
Occam's
they thought that
razor,
was a good idea. I
the
don't. That's
well,
remarkable.
that's why the Occam's razor in me thinks that it was a setup.
Yeah.
Not for everybody, but that some, that there were plenty of people who thought we got to do a debate before we pass the last exit,
Yeah.
to go to the nomination. And given how it played out, given now everything we've learned about concerns the previous 18 months to that debate moment, I certainly think the circumstantial case is pretty strong. That at least some people who were advocating the early debate had a different motivation.
Yeah.
Look, and here's the way I could rationalize it. Hey, if he does great, all the better.
Right.
Right? Like, it was, hey, let's throw him into the deep end. He either swims or he doesn't.
Right.
Yeah.
And it took about
Um,
15 seconds to figure out what was happening in that debate.
um, the 2025 elections are which can both be overly sometimes overinterpreted, but I think over time have actually served as a pretty good appetizer for the following midterm. I look back at 1993, the surprising Republican success foreshadowed what was a huge year, a huge changing of the guard for Republicans, a new wave of Republicans following the elections of Christie Todd Whitman, George Allen, Rudy Giuliani, right? That was all happened in 93, and it definitely foreshadowed 94. I think 2017 with Ralph Northam and Phil Murphy, and that foreshadowed 2018 here. I think Virginia feels like it's the outlier, right? The federal government worker situation, the Supreme Court ruling only is going to make Abigail Spanberger's job that much easier. That the federal government workers don't always turn out. They're turning out this cycle. I don't think that's going to be an issue. So we take that one off the table. The two races that I think are going to tell us a little bit about the midterms going forward, for me, are less Virginia and more New Jersey and New York for different ways. But where are you? Do you concur with that?
Yeah, I mean, with both New Jersey and Virginia, I would say it's about the margin and not the winner. I mean, Democrats should win New Jersey and Virginia. I mean, these are Democratic leaning states that
Hmm.
usually elect a Democrat under normal circumstances. So if Democrats don't win either of them, that should be a
That in
big
itself
warning
is a big
sign.
deal. Yeah.
But then look at the margin, because the margin will tell us more about, is the Trump coalition transferable to other
Hmm.
Republican candidates in New Jersey, for example. New Jersey was Trump got closer than expected. New Jersey was almost as close as Arizona. Like who would have thought that in the 2024 election? And
Hmm.
so how close can Chitterelli get to Mikie Sherrill? That will be because, and Chitterelli is interesting because he has done a full kind of about face on Trump
He went from
himself. I
being
mean,
Chris Christie to Donald Trump, basically,
right.
right? Yeah.
And so but what is the margin? And when I think Mikie Sherrill does he have the advantage in New York? I'm a little colder on terms of what it tells us about federal, 2026 federal elections,
Hmm.
because it's such a unique circumstance. I mean, I think there is an appetite, like, against the Democratic establishment, but
Hmm.
the people that are involved in that Democratic race, or the current mayor Abrams and Cuomo, have just been they're such flawed individuals,
Right.
politically and personally, that I don't know that, okay, they got thrown out, or they were
Right.
denied their position. Does that mean that every random Democratic member of Congress is going to lose? Like, I'm
Well, let
skeptical.
me let me throw a recipe together though for you. I think, and maybe Democrats should be glad this is the case. I'm very curious to see how Cheryl handles Mamdani. Because I think, look, the spillover, what happens in New York City is going to matter to the New Jersey northern suburbs. Those folks commute in and out, right? There's specific issues, including congestion pricing, that we know that has created, can create some tension even among fellow Democrats on that issue, because obviously it's New Jersey folks that are paying that price. But here you have Cheryl decidedly on one end of the Democratic Party spectrum, Mamdani decidedly on the other end, right? And Mamdani is going to be a larger figure hovering over the New Jersey governor's race than he will anywhere else.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, and that's something that I'm just curious about. How does Cheryl handle it? I had an interesting conversation with Rahm Emanuel for my Newsphere show for this weekend. The full episode will be on this weekend. He singled that out. He goes, it's going to be interesting to see how she manages that. And it's a good test. He had can you, can you, uh, can you thread that needle so that you don't alienate your own progressive base, that you still need to
Right.
show up, and at the same time, comfort swing voters that you're not a socialist.
Right. And right, if she can do it without alienating the base, but it does give her an opportunity to look more moderate compared to someone who is
Hmm.
not that far away. So she can't. Democrats can't afford to have a dip in turnout. Nor neither can Republicans. But she will.
Hmm.
I think that is more relevant than looking ahead to 2026 and say, okay,
Right.
is the let's get even beyond 2026, when we're looking back at the 2026 elections, are we going to be saying, yeah, wow, that election was a referendum on the mayor of New York, or the failed mayoral
Yeah.
candidate of New York? I'm like, I don't, we just haven't had elections like that. We should be open-minded, but that's not usually how the
No,
election.
but I do think that you're going to see a lot more Democratic primaries. I mean, and that's what I'm curious about. And at what point are you going to be able to sort of have the data to show, obviously it'll be a few months of, like, are we going to see more competitive Democratic primaries this cycle than we've seen in, say, a decade, right? My gut is that's what's going to happen, but let's wait for the data. What are you seeing so far? Do you feel like you're seeing more people thinking about jumping in, more sort of challenges to sitting incumbents?
Yes is the short answer. I don't have the specific number, but I think there is more, particularly among challenges to older Democratic members.
Hey, our friends at the hotline
Pressure there.
started the old congressional list, which I thought was a good idea.
Yeah, no, it's got
To keep track of this. Yeah.
and those are largely. I'm trying to think of an exception. in very Democratic districts.
Marcy
And so the
Kaptur would be
primaries,
the only one that isn't. Like she's in a swing district and she's over 75. She's arguably, but that would be one where the National Party might step in and say, don't do this. She's like, she could be the only one that can hold that district.
so what is the fallout from, let's say, a dozen or more competitive
Mhm.
Democratic primaries in Democratic districts? Well, if you get a new generation of younger, more progressive Democrats that could push the party to the left, but it's going to be hard to push the party to the left without the White House, without the Senate.
Mhm.
It'll be rhetoric more than it will be specific policies. So yeah, Democrats are wrestling for their new identity. I think it will get a little bit younger, uh, but the fallout for the general elections, it's going to be, I think, minimal because of the districts
Mhm.
where these are taking place.
Um, a few, there was, this is a bit of news happened the last couple days, and I know you've followed sort of the over the years the sort of the line of religion and the influence of religion on political campaigns, and sort of just out of nowhere over the last couple of days, right? The IRS announced that they're no longer going to enforce this. And I guess it was not a law. I mean, I always thought it was just a law, but it may have been, I guess, an executive order by LBJ. But this idea that active churches, synagogues, mosques cannot directly engage in politics. Um, and now they're saying no, churches now can't endorse political candidates. Um, it just sort of happened, and there's just sort of a shrug of shoulders. I feel like 2 decades ago, this would have been monumental, right? This would have been a huge story. Big deal or small deal, as far as you're concerned?
Uh, I I'm gonna say bigger deal than the attention that it's getting is what you're talking about, because the fallout is there's multiple things. I mean, there's the political kind of campaign finance aspect of it, that some people say, well, churches have been doing this for years anyway, whether it's African American churches or whether it's now kind of Trump focused
Mhm.
churches, that this has been going on. Now it's just, it can be more official. But
Right.
I'm also interested in what is the impact on the churches themselves, meaning if as churches get more explicit about their politics, does that attract or detract people from coming to that
Are
congregation?
we going to have
And
red congregations and blue congregations, right? I mean, are we going to
we
suddenly
probably kind of
see?
already do, but maybe more
I
so.
know.
But where do
Well, it
people
used
go
to
that don't
be.
want a
Well,
red
it
or
used
blue
to be
congregation?
Episcopalians versus Catholic. It used to be you'd find another form of Christianity, perhaps that you might, if you're super lefty, maybe the Unitarians, right? Or something like that. Um, but
And
yeah, go ahead.
and where my mind also went, because maybe I've been doing this too long and a little bit jaded, is what's the definition of a church, right? What stops a political entity that may not be religious, but sort of forming a church in order
Mhm.
to engage in political activity and get around some of the other other
Well, look,
constraints that are put on them?
let's get right at the heart of this. So I go ahead and give money to my synagogue, get a tax deduction, and now they can use that money for campaigning. I mean,
Yeah.
we're not that far away from. Are we going to start allowing tax deductions directly for campaign contributions? I'm sure Donald Trump wouldn't care if that was the law going forward. Where are we going to draw the line here?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's well, I'm, I don't take policy positions, but
Right.
I think this takes us to places that we're maybe really not prepared for, and it probably isn't healthy. I
No,
mean,
we're going to get actual clergy running. Not to say clergy haven't run before,
yeah.
but you're going to get more that decide to do it. Maybe they feel as if they've got such a following in their congregation. Why not try to turn that into a political following? I certainly am uncomfortable with it. The mixing, but I grew up at an age, and sometimes I often wonder: Are we living in Are we living in an outlier period, we grew up in an outlier period, and actually, you know, before in the 50s, churches did engage in politics, right? Like this was the norm in the 19th century. Religion and politics in many ways were fused. The women's suffrage movement was fused with, you couldn't disaggregate it, but then of course religion was more mainstream in everybody's life in the 19th century and the early 20th century as well.
In politics, politics has been a part of most churches, but it's just going to increase. And it feels like there is no place. Where can you go now
You
in
can't
in the
escape. Yeah.
country that it's what sport you're watching now? You can't even which teams you're following. You can't even follow a certain sport without it feels like taking a side on, whether you're for this party or that party. I'm like, come on, let's churches should stay focused on the missions that they have been given
Yeah.
from whatever authority they are relying on it. I don't.
No, I
I'm
mean,
going to get
look,
myself
if
in trouble, Chuck. But
no, I hear you, but
it's a
look,
good question.
no, I mean, I've been very concerned about the idea that where do we teach morals anymore? Where do our kids learn more, morals outside the home, right? The parents obviously are a big drivers of this, but in many ways, religious schools, whether it was Sunday school or a Bible study camp or something, but that and I'm not a very religious person, and so I'm just caught in the middle on this. At the same time, um, religion gets used, can get weaponized, all that politically and in such uncomfortable ways to marginalize certain groups. And now you're sort of giving more tools for that to happen. I think this is going to be bad for the long-term health of religion in general, right? We've already seen although it's plateaued of late, a slow decrease in church attendance. Feels like every year, right? It was just every year. You can't tell me this is going to help that problem.
It's going to blur the lines between uh, partisanship and moral, ethical
Mm-hmm.
behavior. I mean, that if you are endorsing a candidate, then you're kind of saying that your church aligns with that party or that person, and so the other side must be evil then. And when you start to
Yeah.
think in those terms, you start to say and do things that are not healthy,
Yeah.
because you start to think of
No,
them as other.
I always get uncomfortable, and I understand why elected officials do this, but they'll be at a disaster like what we're seeing in Central Texas, and they'll say, well, God's hidden hand played a role in saving these lives. Well, then, so you're saying God didn't play a role? God played also a role in not saving those lives? Like, I understand they're trying to say it as a comforting mechanism, but when you
Right.
take it to its logical end, that's an uncomfortable place to be. That because you're implying that God is picking and choosing who gets to live and who gets to die, and I don't know if that's where people want their faith going.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Yeah, I know. You don't
it's
like to
not
get into
good.
these
It's
things.
not good.
I
No,
can
it's
feel
good.
your
It's healthy.
discomfort, but it is
No,
where
but
we're,
it's not. I mean, it's good. It's very relevant, and I think unfortunately, as with a lot of things, it's just there are some intended consequences and
yeah.
unintended consequences, and it's going to be a few years as this really rolls out to see.
I,
Okay, this is
yeah.
how people take it.
I don't think this is if you're hoping that religion can become a safe haven from politics, this is not the way to do it. Let's put it that way. This is only going to I think create more tumult in that world. A few other things before I get to sort of my obsession with third parties and independent candidacies and where things go. There, I was intrigued by a Democratic primary poll out of Michigan that indicated that voting with Biden could be an effective message against. It was the Michigan race where there's a state representative running against a U.S. member of Congress, and that the one differentiator, this was obviously a poll conducted for the state legislator, that the biggest differentiator in a general election is that voting with Biden is a net negative for a Democrat. That was an interesting sort of yellow flag. I thought when I was thinking, and this goes back to the conversation we started earlier, which is if Democrats underperform, what would be the explanations? How heavy is the Biden baggage going to be?
Well, it's heavy. I mean, he lost. Democrats did not do well in the
Right.
2024 elections, and he still continues to make news. I mean, in part because whether it's books or whether it's the investigations that the administration wants to have on him and the people that worked around him. So the more time that's spent talking about Biden, I think the worse off Democrats are in general. But this is a Democratic primary in Michigan where you have to make distinctions, where if there
Hmm.
aren't big policy differences. And Michigan, being seen as pro Biden could be a liability in Michigan where Trump won, and I think that is the extent. But to see it so explicitly is pretty
Hmm.
rare, particularly based on the recency of President Biden's administration. It was over 6 months ago.
There's no penalty in trashing Biden as a Democrat, is there?
I don't think so. I don't. I mean, the amount
It
of people
reminds me of
that
early
get upset
Carter.
are,
That's
there's like 6 people who are going to be upset, I think,
right. That's
and
what
most of
happened
them
to
probably
Jimmy
don't live in
Carter.
Michigan. So yeah.
That's what happened to
So
Jimmy
that
Carter in Mondale. It became really easy to just say, no, I'm not one of those Democrats. And like literally people wanted to move on as fast as they could. And there, and it does feel like Biden, you can feel that. I think look, the reason I'm intrigued by it in a Democratic primary in Michigan in 2026, because there's going to be quite a few people that have Biden connections running for president in 2028, right? I'm in particular Pete Buttigieg. Here's a guy who was an outsider candidate when he ran in 2020. Now he's a Biden cabinet official, right? Does that make it impossible? I admire. I think he's a very talented political athlete, right? I think you know there are many people that couldn't get out of that, but I don't. I'm curious to see how he balances that. Ditto
right,
with a
and
Kamala Harris.
there are going to be lanes. There are going to be the Washington. There are going to be people from Washington running. There's going to be governors who are going to run. They say,
Hmm.
I'm not a part of that. There's also going to be an even more. There's going to be an outsider lane that right now it feels like Stephen A. Smith is the only one kind of occupying that. But I think there is an appetite there that from someone who is not even a governor, not even an elected official outside of
Someone from
Washington.
outside of the
Uh,
world of
right.
politics. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And
There's
so
definitely going to
there's
be an
going to
appetite for
be, I
that.
don't know who that's going to be yet,
Right.
but there'll be someone that will get some attention and sort of rise up, right? Maybe the Vivek Ramaswamy sort of the 2028
Yeah.
Democratic primary.
Was he a success or a failure though?
I mean, he's done pretty well for a losing candidate in the presidential race. He's done pretty
Hmm.
well. I mean, he's on track to. I mean, he was on that national stage with all these people who've been doing politics their whole life. He's on
Yeah.
the debate stage, and then now he's set up to be governor of Ohio. That's not a bad
Boy, it
landing
almost
spot.
feels like that's a done deal. And yet I'm very skeptical. Ramaswamy is somebody who I don't know if he wears well. And that's why I was surprised he jumped in so early. It is we'll see. I mean, I think
But
Ramaswamy's a guy that makes a really good first impression, and then the shtick can wear thin over time.
we'll see. He people like. I remember the convention, and I think it was actually after pretty soon after we saw you in the hallway on the concourse that
Hmm. Yeah.
Ramaswamy came by, and wherever he went, he was just swarmed with people at the convention that
Hmm.
wanted to, they wanted to see him and like him. I think that
Hmm.
uh, you know, yeah, as people get to see more of him, we'll see if that wanes. But I think there's a likability there because of the outsider tell it like
Hmm.
it is. That's what gets rewarded right now in our politics.
All right, let's talk Elon Musk and his money. The thing that matters most in his interest in developing a third party or supporting independence, however he ends up deciding to do this, is the checkbook, right? The single biggest impediment to a serious third party challengers are money because of the in some states onerous rules for getting on the ballot if you're not one of the two major parties. Um, Look, we can sit here and debate all of the weirdness of Musk and all the different ways that this might go away, but let's assume Musk is going to write a check to the Libertarians. I don't know if I'd be starting a new party right now, but maybe he'll help finance certain independent candidacies. Um, where would you go if you were him? If you wanted to make a difference?
That's a good question. Where would I go? Um, Well, it depends on who he's trying to help. Is he just trying to punish? What are his goals? I mean,
Well,
is he just trying to
let's
create?
take
Maybe
him at
that's the
his
first.
let's take him at his word, which is he's looking for a group of senators and a handful of House members who aren't members of either party who will act sort of as a ballast, right? As a nope, you guys are in charge this cycle. Nope, sort of no labels, but do it at the ballot box, right? It sounds like that's so. Let's take him at his word that he's looking for center right and center left, right? Sort of the liberty. He's looking. There's no doubt to me he's looking for cultural libertarians who are free traders, right? And who believe in science and right. This weird. So I think if he's serious, he writes a big check to the libertarians and says, "Hey, go become a serious party. Let me help you become a more serious party. Go find more serious candidates, et cetera, et cetera." But let's accept the premise that's what he's looking for. So, like, I've been obsessed with John Cornyn. John Cornyn can't win a Republican primary, but I think John Cornyn, if you had a three-way race between John Cornyn, Colin Allred, and Ken Paxton, I think John Cornyn wins that race. I think that he represents the largest chunk of voters in Texas ideologically than any of the other two candidates. But can he get on the ballot, right? Can he do this without the support of a major party and the major party donors? And that's a big question mark to me.
Even in that Texas scenario, I mean, Texas is a Republican state. It was a big state
Mm-hmm.
for Trump and Ted Cruz, but you get an energized Democratic, unified Democratic Party, behind Allred or whomever the nominee is going to
Mm-hmm.
be. I think a fractured center and center right creates an opportunity for Democrats to win. And so the challenge, where I'm struggling with overlaying specific targets is that as
Mm-hmm.
long as you have a Democrat and a Republican nominee, that it's going to be tough. uh, it's going to be tough for that third party candidate. Or I mean, they could make a difference, but you might be hurting the broader agenda that you're trying to reach. I mean, unless he's
Mm-hmm.
trying to elect Democrats, then getting behind the Libertarian Party is probably not the best way. The best way to do it.
Well, if I were advising him, I'd tell him to write half his checks to the Libertarians and half his checks to the Forward Party, right? Meaning go find center left and center right and figure out in which state which which flavor essentially would be better. Like I proposed if I were in his shoes, the experiments I would do would be in Florida and Texas, right? Because you have dominant Republican parties that are fractured, that are divided. It's a very divided Republican Party in Texas. It is more of a divided. It's more of a there's a non-existent Democratic Party, right? They literally had to recruit a Republican to run for governor, in some ways, and that Senate race is going to be semi-uncontested, potentially not totally uncontested, but they're going to have a very underfunded candidate on the Democratic side. So you could sit here and help a corn in there and then say help a center left guy in a Florida. That would if he were again if he's serious about this, that to me is how I would engage at the beginning. Would be messing around in those two states.
Yeah.
Look, he's a lot of business interest in Texas, so he's a lot of reasons to be engaged in Texas, less so in Florida.
He missed an opportunity, right? When we're talking about third parties in general, I think it has to be personality driven, and I think he
Mm-hmm.
is a larger than life personality
He could be Perot-like, right?
with an established businessman. He has a lot of things that people trust more than politicians. But by getting so involved with Trump in 2024, helping Trump and getting involved at the almost the super cabinet level, he's alienated everyone. I mean, he's alienated Democrats and now he's alienated Republicans because Trump doesn't like him, and now he's in political no man's land. And so, but I think the ingredients were there pre 2024 for
Mm-hmm.
for Elon to create something that could have had an impact, and now it's it's just back to square one. I think it's going to be very sporadic in terms of where he might be able to have an impact. Having it be organized, because Chuck, for me, fundamentally, there's the logistics that we've talked about and you've talked
Right.
about, but there's also what are you for? What are you for? And when you start talking about you could say we hate Republicans, we hate Democrats, we need something else, but then you start saying what you're for, and you start losing people in the coalition. Like, oh, we think
Right.
this on guns, or this on taxes, this on abortion, and people are like, all right, I'm out. This was fun, but I'm not. I can't get on board with that. So I don't see how you hold it together if you don't have someone who is
I know a friend of mine always likes to
post-partisan.
say, he says, the Libertarian Party is always interesting to me. And then you find out they don't believe in driver's licenses. Right. And then you're like, well, how the hell do I defend that? Right. I can't run on that libertarian line, type of mindset. So you're not wrong. Right. It's sort of one of those things that the minute people find out what you advocate, you're like, wait, why do you do that? What's that about?
And maybe if you have a personality that is bigger than, Trump says some things, but say, well, that's just Trump being Trump. But he has
Right.
this among a group of Americans. He has a reputation that, well, whatever he says goes, or even when he says things that I don't like, it doesn't matter. It matters less than the bigger picture. But there's few people right now in this country that have that enough of a following to kind of enact that politically, period.
Look, the other two states that I think he could play in are the two states that actually have ranked choice voting, at least in some parts of their elections, and that's Alaska and Maine, right? So it's easier to start a party there. It's easier to get on the ballot in those two states. And who knows, Maine could be a free-for-all, as we just discussed with Susan Collins. Maybe she doesn't run. Maybe Susan Collins doesn't want to run as a Republican. What if she decides to pull an Angus King and run as an I? That's a curiosity to me. I think some people thought she might do that. The fact that she voted against the Senate bill, I read that as somebody who's at least wants to try to run as at least an independent-minded Republican, right? In Maine, if she ends up doing it. But those would be, Florida and Texas to me are one type of experiment. Maine and Alaska would be, frankly, cheaper experiments.
Yeah, and you still have to have candidates, right? I mean, this is in concept. You could start to you're making the case, but who is actually the candidate? Can you get someone who doesn't have the baggage, but also has the credibility to be this alternative to other known commodities? Because even for people who want change, they want to have some faith in the person that they're voting for, even if they don't like the people that they're familiar with or they voted for in the past. So finding candidates the right candidate is going to be key too. I mean, with Dan Osborne, who just announced he's running again in Nebraska. I was just going to say, I wanted to bring, I think that he was maybe as much of a outsider as you can be, and still fell short and had Democratic support behind the scenes, but still fell well short against an incumbent, Deb Fischer, who was kind of took her race for granted and really needed help at the end. And that race didn't end up being that close.
The interesting thing to me about the Osborne race, I was going to bring up this, and I'm just to get your head ready. We'll talk about Michigan governor in a few minutes.
Yep.
The two places where we will have independent candidates that will be in double digits, and then from there the question is how far else do they go? The one thing that intrigues me on Osborne is the contrast, right? His setup video. Are we so angry at the elites and at the rich that just being a billionaire is a negative, and voters will just say, you know what, I'm tired of these rich guys. I'm not saying that I find that contrast with Ricketts intriguing, and at least it is. Look, it's not lost on me the history of Nebraska populists, right? William Jennings Bryan. If we're going to see a sea change of a sort of a revolt against the Gilded Age, right? A revolt against all this excess that's out there, he's perhaps set up the contrast as cleanly as anybody out there right now.
Contrast is there. The state is still difficult, right? I mean, it's still, Ricketts can afford to have a few people that are done with, the establishment ability, all those things, and still win And he also has, I think he'll just fundamentally run a better campaign. Ricketts will run a better campaign.
Sure, because he's going to see he'll be more prepared. Right.
And so, but yeah, the I can see the snare. I've learned to be open-minded
I know. So have
after some
I. Right. You
elections,
kind of have
but
to be, right?
like,
Yeah. Oh, well, look, here's
it's
how I
tough.
talk myself out of Osborne. He's not going to be as to me the I find the farm states the most fascinating for this next cycle, because if the tariffs are as damaging to our economy as I think they're going to be, Kansas, Iowa, and Nebraska become three Senate races that I become obsessed with, right? Because those are places where they are, Kansas farmers already impacted by the AID cuts. Nebraska and Iowa would be sensitive to that. But is Dan Osborne anti-tariff?
You should have him on.
Right. No, I think
Have him on.
that is going to be the I think, can he take advantage of what I think could be the best opportunity, right? As far as a wedge issue against the Republican incumbent.
I've written many times, particularly for roll call, about just because you lose a race doesn't mean that you can't win a future race. And I hate it
Hmm.
when people say, "Oh, loser," Osborne lost this or any, because there's like, I mean, John Thune lost a race before he won a race, and
Right.
look how far that got him. So it's, but it's just the math is tough. A lot of things have to go right,
Hmm.
for Osborne or any third party
Hmm.
candidate who's trying to make this work.
Well, let's talk about the math equation in Michigan.
Yeah.
Because it's a fascinating Michigan governor is probably if you're kind of intrigued about third party politics and how do you be disruptive to the two major parties, Michigan is going to be your favorite race to follow. Duggan's going to have certainly have financial support. He's not the self funder, but he's going to have major players in the Detroit community are helping finance his campaign. Um, he's likely to face a Democratic nominee who's not from Detroit,
Right.
in Jocelyn Benson, assuming she is the Democratic nominee. And then you have the John
John
James,
James. Yeah.
an African American member of Congress, a Republican. I think the racial politics are going to be interesting and how that sort of breaks out. And if I was just looking at it demographically, I would say that seems to me to be the key to understanding who wins, right? Where do Detroit's African American voters go? To the mayor, to the Democratic nominee, or to the African American candidate?
Yeah, there was a survey, and I should have had this at my fingertips. A survey that showed that Duggan was taking equally from both parties, and
He was the only one with a net positive favorable rating, I think, with every single group of voters. He was just no, he was net, he had a positive fave among Dems, positive fave among Indies, positive fave among Republicans, and a really low name ID outside of Detroit, by the way.
right, and I think that he is more of a threat to the Democrats as a I guess now former Democratic
Hmm.
mayor. I think that in a state where Democrats they need a lot of things to go right in order to win. I mean, Gretchen Whitmer showed that it's possible to win, but also Biden lost.
Hmm.
So Democrats can't afford to have any disproportional gap or loss in their votes, or else they're going to, then James will be set up. James will be set up well. So Democrats, their best bet. I don't know what those conversations are looking like, or how convinced he is in staying in the race, but I think Democrats are going to try to get him out because I think he's more of a threat to them than he
I
is to
don't know
them.
how they get him out. What's the incentive to get him out? He already left the
I
party.
don't I don't know
The
what his
the
down.
most
Yeah, what is his downside?
What's the downside here,
There's no risk for. I don't know what the risk is for him.
right? Like the only thing that I could see that could be a fascinating jujitsu for Jocelyn Benson is if she ends up attacking Duggan for being Biden, for being too close to Biden. Because, Duggan was sort of Biden's favorite mayor. Duggan's son ran the Biden for president Michigan campaigns, I think both in 2020 and 2024. Definitely is a close relationship there, right? I mean, Biden early on he saw, he jumped on Duggan for mayor back at the very beginning. So it's a real relationship there. That's the one little weird jujitsu when we were talking about, is Biden how heavy is the Biden baggage? Could it actually apply to somebody who's not a Democrat?
I think they will try everything. I think Democrats will try everything to try to discredit
Mhm.
and minimize Duggan's vote, and that certainly seems like a possibility.
All right, before I get to my get to a topic that I really wanted to have a conversation with you about, which was the athletics uh, um, uh, uh, ranking of which conference is the biggest liar to the American public as far as name versus that. And we're going to get to that in a minute. But before we leave campaigns and before we leave the midterms, what's a few issues we're not talking about that you think could that you are expecting to bubble up more on the campaign trail in the summer and fall of 26 that we're not paying enough attention to right now?
It's good. I think trying to think of a surprise issue. I think that there are the ingredients for what is going to be a bigger story later on down the line. But I mean, fundamentally, our elections usually come down to the economy, and we're talking about the potential for tariffs and things. Healthcare is going to be a part of it because of the reconciliation bill that
Hmm.
just passed, Medicaid cuts. But these are things that are out there. So I'm trying to,
Let me,
what
we
is
could
a
flip it this way. Is immigration less impactful in 26? Or, one of the voters don't vote on things they're satisfied with, right? We've learned that over the years. Hey, the economy's great. All right, now I'm going to vote against the incumbent for another reason, right? Sometimes that we'll get
right?
that, but um,
I think
that's
immigration is going to be a key. It's going to be a big issue because think the administration is just getting more and more emboldened with how they are enacting these deportations. And Republicans, remember when we were talking about lessons learned? I think Republicans are relying on this to a fault. Oh, well, we were elected. We're just doing what we said we are going to do. And I would take that to say, okay, well, I think a
mhm,
majority of Americans do want violent criminals who are in this country illegally to be deported,
right.
but the president and Republicans have pushed that line, right? They've pushed it to, well, not just violent criminals, but if you're in this country illegally, well, that's criminal. And well, you may not be, we may not know whether you're a citizen, but we're going to just deport you anyway. And they keep kind of moving the line. And as people see more of these arrests, deportations play out on video, people's cell phone videos and things, I think there is going to be more uncomfortability with the implementation of the policy that maybe in theory people agreed with. So I expect immigration to be it's one great example of, I think, the Republicans reading the
An
wrong
over
lesson from
Potentially
the
an
2024
overreach.
election. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, there's an interesting piece of data that our friend Dante Cini has been doing at the American Communities Project, and he noted that when you ask the same voter the most important issues in their local community and the most important issues nationally, the biggest discrepancy is immigration. Locally, they don't see immigration as a top five issue. Nationally, they see it as a top two issue. It's
Yeah.
literally same voter.
Yep. And that's probably some effect of news and what they're reading or
Yeah,
seeing or watching, that, oh,
yeah.
well, over there in that city or in that state, things are bad, even if they're not experiencing it in their, but the more that these happen, it's going
Hmm.
to filter into communities that may not be, hotbeds for immigration, because
Yeah.
surprise, surprise, Chuck, there are immigrants all over the country. They're a part of
Well,
they're a part of the country, and
and
some
by
people
the
are
way,
getting deported that people wouldn't expect.
well, and then there's all sorts of personal stories. I've had family members who, if you just looked at them, you'd say, "Oh, are they Mexican?" They're American citizens. Um, they've been stopped and detained, while trying to travel. I mean, it is just the aggressive nature, and there's these little anecdotes. A lot of people are hearing this. My goodness, an American citizen was held for how long? Right? Like until they had to prove they had to prove their citizenship. It's a Those stories could start accumulating.
Yeah, because we're a long way
And
away from the election.
yeah, yeah. All right. The 4th of July week is always filled with a lot of filler um, stories, right? We do it in the
No,
political
really?
world, and they do it in the sports world. And our friends at the Athletic, I love this. Jason Kirk, it was, he was talking about the new Pac-12. You're an Oregon State guy, so I know you're still holding the flag for the Pac-12.
It's rough. It's
and
rough.
and the conference is going to stay in existence. Thank you to Texas State, right? Which of course is one of the great Pacific Rim colleges in America that gets there. So he put together a name accuracy quotient for all the conferences, and he ranked them from 1 to 10, with basically trying to decide, is the Pac-12 the biggest liar or not? And what I loved about it is that he punished math, basically lying about math more than lying about geography. So the Big Ten ended up being the most, basically the most misleading name, since they have 18 members of the Big Ten, versus punishing the Atlantic Coast Conference for having 2 teams on the Pacific Coast. So I thought that was, do you think that was fair, that we should punish these conferences more for their math problems versus their geography problems?
The name and the geography. Seeing Stanford play in the ACC is a problem to me. Big Ten, hey, big. I guess big now means from California to Rutgers. Rutgers, you can
Coast
have,
to
it's
coast,
big.
baby.
It's
Yeah.
big. It's Big Ten. Even though I don't, I will never forgive those Pac-10, Pac-12 teams that left for the Big Ten.
Right.
But yeah, it is hard. The ACC, I think that's the big.
You're going
And
to put
Texas
them
State,
last. Yeah.
Chuck, should I remember Texas State growing up? At least Texas State was a movie featuring Sinbad and Kathy Ireland as the I think they were the Texas State Armadillos. Texas State was not a real school growing. At least when I grew up, it was
So
a
this
movie
is
that you
life
watched.
imitating art, imitating life, right?
Now Texas State is going to be a rival to the Beavers. I mean, I guess, but
I
it's
wish they
strange.
would.
What world are we living in?
And you guys have Gonzaga now for like basketball. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, they don't. At least Oregon State should play them in football. I think that would go. That should go.
Actually,
Could be a
though, you
win.
guys are doing what the one thing that I love that you guys are doing. If I think I read this correctly. Is there a home and home between Oregon State and Washington State now
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
regular
yes,
season for football?
yes. Which is funny because as this everything was starting to come apart in the Pac-12, there was a funny shirt that I saw that I should have bought. It said, week 1, OSU versus WSU, week 2, Beavers versus Cougars, week 3, like Washington State versus Oregon State. It was just all variations. So that ended up being coming to life, coming true. So hey, why
It would
not?
have been
Why
fun
not?
if you guys could have forced where the Pac-12 still got the automatic berth, right, to the college football playoff for the 2 years, right? Just like really, and then the winner of the 2-team conference, automatic berth, Oregon State, automatic berth, Washington State,
Just what
just
a
a
mess.
little something.
I don't know enough about hockey or college hockey, but I mean, isn't it
Mhm.
kind of a super? It's its own thing, right? Everyone just plays. It feels
Well,
like
so
football. Football needs to be in its own
and you're
thing.
right about hockey. Like people don't realize this. Notre Dame is a member of the ACC for every sport except 2. One is football, where they're an independent, and the second is hockey, because they're in the Big Ten for hockey.
Right.
So there's this interesting, and that is something that I feel like is probably the only thing that's going to save athletics and college athletics, right? Like, I mean, that's the real. If you don't want to see sports totally just gone away, where you're going to see, these you're reading these stories. I think I saw NC State got rid of their diving program, or like everybody but one, because the non-revenue sports, particularly the Olympic sports, are the ones taking it on the chin in this new
We'll
revenue
see
model.
that with NIL what that does, but to students who choose to go to places because of their geography, I think I remember there was a story about with some University of Oregon Duck softball players who were like, we didn't know that we were going to be playing in New Jersey. Like when we signed up, they were going to have conference games in New Jersey. Like what are
Well, but
we
this has
what are we
become a real
doing?
issue
That's
for
not
the
what we signed up.
parents. It's a
Yeah.
real issue for the parents. Like they're like, whoa, I want to watch my kid play. I got to fly all over the country,
Go
and
at Ann
I mean,
Arbor for a
right.
volleyball game. I mean,
Yeah. No. By the way, the rest of the list, the most honest conference name was Conference USA.
because it's all
So
within it's all it's
that is still a
all
fact. It's all within the United
there's
States.
no Saskatchewan
Yeah,
University or anything in there.
yeah. And then the American Athletic was second. Sun Belt got its is the Sun Belt is actually pretty good. it actually is representative of it is most of the schools are within the Sun Belt. James Madison, is Virginia a
It's
Sun Belt
sunny
state?
there. It's
It
sunny
is.
there.
People wear belts, right? In Harrisonburg, I think.
Yeah.
Every once
Well,
in a
and
while.
Liberty is in. Well. Oh wait, JMU's in Sunbelt. They're not Conference USA.
Yeah, no, JMU's
Oh,
now in Sun Belt. They moved
which
that is moving up.
right down the street from Liberty, Conference USA.
Yeah,
It's funny that
no,
you have
that
two close universities that are in two different conferences.
well, and in their rankings, the Mountain West had been the original number one, and then they added Northern Illinois. And a very important, because the Chicago suburbs and the Rocky Mountains are really close to each other. Yeah,
Exactly.
because it's right there, right on the lake.
The politics are, it's right. It's all. It's right there. Yeah. What a mess. It's
I know,
sad,
it is, and it's like I just sit here and say it's like we've got to have a system. Oregon State and Washington State, they belong with the big boys. It's not fair what happened to them. They just got like abandoned on the side of the road, and it just feels, and nobody seemed to care outside of people in Corvallis and Spokane. But it's kind of was there any attempt, just quickly on politics? Was there any attempt in those state legislatures to do what the state of Virginia did with UVA and Virginia Tech?
I don't. I think the answer is yes. I mean, I know nothing about what happened in the Washington legislature with regard to this. In Oregon, I don't know. I mean, it all felt
Nobody
like
crosses.
it's
Nobody crosses
so much,
Phil Knight, right? Whatever Phil
so
Knight
much
wants, Phil
happened
Knight
behind
gets.
the scenes,
Yeah.
and then it would sort of just was like sprung. And I guess I only hope that some of these schools that left, they are punished in many. Just they've realized that it's more difficult.
Karma.
That it wasn't just
That's
the
right.
money. This money grab was not worth it.
Yeah. Oregon it'll still be decades, Oregon, before you get to win an actual national title.
That was having to face Ohio State in the first round, their first game in the playoff.
There was a punishment.
That's a brutal first draw. So
and I'm guessing you didn't care. You're like, yeah,
no,
you guys were the ones that asked for this,
Yeah, I have a sense of state pride, but it's but in a game between Ohio State and Oregon, one of them has to win, and it's a loss for America. We wish that both teams could lose that game.
Fair enough.
I'm going to alienate. How many other states can I alienate here?
Right. Very quickly, Inside Elections. Where can people find you?
Sure. InsideElections.com. You can also, I'm still on X/Twitter at Nathan L. Gonzalez, but you should also follow my colleague, Jacob Rubashkin. He is much better at social media than I am, and always has some great tidbits that he's dropping in his feed. So yeah, check us out, Inside Elections.
Well, it's great. And it is, yes, it costs some money, but you get good insight.
And actually, Chuck, something that doesn't cost money is our Inside Elections podcast. And in our most recent episode, we had Stu, my former boss, mentor, and colleague, Stu Rothenberg, on episode 50 for us. So that was a fun walk down memory lane.
Did you tape it after a Yankees win or during that losing streak?
That's good. It was in the middle of the day. So
because Cranky Stu is my favorite Stu.
Yeah, he's got a reputation to live up to, but it's fun.
Yeah.
And the podcast costs nothing. You can get a taste of what we're trying to do.
Awesome. Nathan Gonzalez, good to see you. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, Chuck.